It's a topic we shouldn't have to talk about. And I tell every group I do, whether it's a webinar like this or a live presentation, I start with an apology because none of us got into this industry to have to deal with active shooter scenarios. But it's become a way of life. There's reasons for it, as you're going to see in the course of the program this morning. And I hope you'll find it of value to you. My contact information will be on the last slide. I welcome anytime you have questions or afterthoughts or anything like that. You're always welcome to reach out by email, or I tell everybody you're always welcome to call. I'm not your attorney, so I'm not going to charge you for a 15-minute phone call, but you're always welcome to call or question. A little bit on my background, probably one of the most blessed guys you'll ever meet because I've had two dual careers that ran simultaneous. I started my career in the early 1980s at a hospital here in the suburbs of Chicago as the risk management director. Spent 15 years with the hospital, and then as hospitals became part of bigger systems, I had the opportunity to go to the corporate office and spent 5 years there as the corporate director of risk management over the senior care division, which at that time I think had 15 mostly skilled facilities. My business partner, Chris Sorensen, and I started this company in 2001. Today, that number's a little bit low. Don't know the exact number, but it's a significant number of hospitals and senior living facilities we work with. We've got a footprint, as Mary and I were chatting before we started. We've got clients in 49 of 50 states. We just haven't been able to get a foot in the door in Montana for some reason. But we've worked with clients all over the country, and I'm very honored to be here with you. I also had, as I said, dual careers. I also served 35 years in the fire service, retired as fire chief here in the suburbs of Illinois in 2008, and also taught at the State Fire Academy at the U of I for 25 years as well. So a lot of work in not just safety and security and risk, but also in emergency preparedness and safety response, safety management. We're talking today about an active shooter, and every time I do this program, I get so many different definitions of what an active shooter is. Some people want to quantify it. It's got to have X number of victims. That's not necessarily true. Simple definition that we use for an active shooter is it's any individual who's actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill in a confined and populated areas. Most of the time using firearms, but there's been others. We just saw this past weekend in Australia where a number of people were murdered in a shopping mall by a subject with an edged weapon. So, yeah, shooter implies, but I also want you to realize that the things that we're going to talk about this morning don't just apply to somebody with a gun. They can apply to anybody that's armed. And when I say armed, I want you to realize, number one, let's get it right out. When I use the term weapon, I'm not necessarily talking about a firearm. A weapon is anything that can be used to hurt you. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But as we go through that, an active shooter event is not a security event. It's not a code gray or code silver or any of the other silly color codes that we use. It's somebody who's actively trying to wreak havoc and cause death. It's not a person with a weapon. As I said earlier, a weapon can be anything that can be used to hurt you. So that's a pretty broad scope. It's not a hostage event. It is somebody who is actively trying to cause havoc and injure and kill as many people as possible. First thing we've got to do, though, guys, this is number one. This is your first homework assignment. We've got to get past that prevailing attitude that says it won't happen here. And I say this with no disrespect to anybody. Like I said, I'm very blessed. I work all over the country with a number of incredible communities and hospitals as well. But I see this especially in the smaller towns. Oh, Steve, we know everybody in town. Everybody knows everybody's business, but blah, blah, blah. For every excuse you give me, I can show you an event that has happened that defies that logic. One of the best ways that I can explain it, though, is I'm going to run a short video here, and it's called Any Given Day, and you'll see why. The individual, you may not know him by name, but you'll know his story. He's a very dear friend of mine. I've had the privilege over the last 5 or 6 years that I've known him now of working with him across the country, doing active shooter training programs. He doesn't train on the active shooter event because of what he went through and the PTSD that he still deals with all these years later. But he does talk about how to recover after it happens. But his message that it can happen any given day. Like I said, he's a dear friend. I'm honored to call him a friend. And it's this was an impromptu video. We were doing an active shooter program here in my community. I had him here as a guest speaker. And I just called a buddy of mine up who's got a small production company and said, "Hey, can you bring a camera over here to the conference center at the Hilton Garden Inns and just shoot a prompt video for me?" And he did it, and this is how it turned out. But listen to the message, because it will really defy that mindset that says it won't happen here.
My name is Frank DeAngelis, and I was at Columbine High School for 35 years. I spent the last 18 years of my career as principal of the high school. And if you would have asked me April 20th, 1999, could a Columbine have happened at Columbine, I would have said, no way. It was a school in which we had our kids graduate, 95% of our kids graduate on time, over 85% of our kids went on to college, a lot of parental support. It was a school that was known for its excellence. And then April 20th, 1999 happened, a day in which my life changed forever, along with all the people that were part of the Columbine school community. And I'm amazed when I go out to these other communities that experience similar tragedies, such as Chardon in Ohio or Virginia Tech or Sandy Hook. They're in a state of denial, also feeling that it does not happen. And my message to you is it could happen to anyone on any given day. And I think it is so important that you're prepared. And just by not talking about it does not mean it's not going to happen. And many of the lessons learned from Columbine are being implemented today that are saving lives. So once again, don't underestimate the power of tragedy striking your community. I think it's so important to be prepared, because once again, on any given day, it can come into your community.
And there's your homework assignment, guys. Please don't allow yourselves to get into that mindset that says,
Frank
oh,
DeAngelis,
stop it,
and
Frank.
I was the Columbine.
Please don't allow yourself to get into that mindset that says it won't happen here. It's happened in a lot of places. You know, here's one in Salt Lake City that happened a couple of years ago, where an individual goes into a senior living community, you know, and starts shooting. And again, we don't hear about a lot of these. If we have a high casualty count, you know, Columbine, 13 people died. We heard about that on the news. Pine Lake, 7 people died. We heard about that on the news. But when it happens once in Portland, Oregon, or it happens once and one person is a victim in Baltimore, or one person is the victim in Miami, it's not going to be on the news here in Chicago, because it doesn't sell news. But when you've got a mass casualty incident, now a lot of people are paying attention to it. So, you know, just because you're not hearing about it on the news, it's happening, I promise you. And we'll talk about some of the causes here as we go. You know, here's another one happened in California not too long ago. You know, 3 to 5 gunshots fired from the manager's office. Manager's been gunned down by a person who had a resident who had a problem with him. So again, we have to. I think a lot of people are familiar. I mentioned Pine Lake a couple minutes ago. Yeah, this was a number of years ago, but it still happened. 7 people were killed, 6 residents and 1 employee. When an individual went in, he had been served with divorce papers, and his mindset was, if I can't have her, nobody's going to have her. His wife worked in the memory care unit, and he went in to gun her down. And when the unit was locked down and he couldn't get in, he went into a rage and just walked around shooting people. He shot 6 residents and killed them, and shot 1 employee and killed him. So, you know, again, it can happen in so many different ways, but let's not ever allow ourselves to think that it can't happen to us. We also have to realize that we've got a lot of regulatory oversight that doesn't always get talked about. Independent facilities, independent housing, anything along those lines, your employees are still regulated, or you are regulated to protect your employees under the OSHA guidelines. Under the assisted living facilities, OSHA guidelines apply again on a federal level, but for assisted living right now, there's really no other federal requirements. Some states have requirements. I think there's about 12 or 13 states that have requirements for compliance. Skilled nursing communities, skilled nursing facilities. Yeah, we've got the CMS Emergency Preparedness Standard. We again have OSHA, and again, some states require more. And in affordable housing, OSHA has a jurisdiction, but HUD also has some guidelines that we have to follow, as well as, again, some states may have more specific. you're going to be responsible for knowing what your requirements are, especially on the state level. The federal guidelines, the OSHA ones, it doesn't talk about specifically about active shooter. It does talk, and same thing with CMS emergency preparedness. It does talk about doing your hazard vulnerability assessment, identifying what your hazards are, and then putting together programmatically methods to minimize, it doesn't say prevent, but to minimize the risk and to minimize the potential for casualties. So, you've got that fiduciary obligation right off the bat of what you have to do to be in compliance and to maintain. You're not going to ever convince any regulatory agency or regulatory compliance officer or surveyor that you don't have the risk. They know it's there. So, every one of your emergency operation plans should include active shooter and should be specific to you. Again, we'll talk about some of that as we go this morning. Now, I get asked a lot, Steve, what are the characteristics of an active shooter? Well, every time there's a major event, there's a ton of behaviorists who start doing behavioral analysis, trying to come up with some kind of checklist or watch list, if you will, of the behaviors that you need to be sensitive to. It's almost impossible to do. You're dealing with human behavior here. Nothing is 100% tried and true when you're dealing with human behavior. We know that. But there have come out a half dozen or so common characteristics of some of these offenders. Now, I'm going to list them, but as I do that, I need a promise from you. And that promise is, and again, this is coming from experience, human nature is, as you're listening to these, you're going to be going, darn, I think he's talking about Herb. Guys, I'm not talking about anybody. Let's agree on that. Please don't form a presupposition against anybody based on these. These are general studies that have been done. It's not targeting any individual. So please don't do that, because that's not fair to an innocent person. But we know that more often than not, the person who's capable of doing this has that brittle personality. I worked for years at the hospital with a gentleman behind his back, never to his face. Behind his back, they used to refer to him as network news. He worked in the housekeeping department. Everybody, and he was a good worker, but everybody knew that he had some bats in the belfry, if you will. And, he just had that very brittle personality behind his back. They called him network news because they said someday he's going to go off and he's going to go on a killing spree, and it's going to be all over the network news stations. And guys, that was back in the 90s. Sadly, he did not, well, fortunately, he did not do that, but sadly, he did take his own life without hurting anybody else. But that brittle personality is an early warning sign. Those individuals that have feelings of persecution, they feel like everything's being done to them. They feel like they're treated unfairly. They're the victim of, in their minds, they're the victim of social injustices. They're the victims of workplace injustices. They feel that there's two sets of rules, one for them, one for everybody else. They get treated differently. They get singled out. They get isolated. Excuse me. These are people who are sensitive to rejection. They don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like they have a place, that they have a role, that they make any significant contribution. They want to be accepted. They want to be a part of the show, if you will, a part of the family, but they're sensitive to rejection. And if they feel like an outsider, then they develop that self-perception of being an outsider, and they will do things to try to force their way in. And oftentimes, if you study the cases, you find that in their manifestos, they often say, I had no other way out. I'm doing this for a number of reasons. If we had more time today, I've got an incredible video that was produced that is by the individual who did the shootings at Virginia Tech, Mr. Cho. And, he talks right in there on camera before he went over and did the shootings at the school, why he was doing it. And he clearly, at the end, saw no other options. And that was one of his statements. I'm doing this not for myself, but for all the others who are treated the way I've been treated, so that nobody will do it to them. So a lot of different characteristics. Like I said, please don't think about any of your staff, any of your visitors or family members or residents or anything like that, because we're not here to single anybody out. How people react to a disaster or to a crisis is often the telltale thing. Now, one of the things that we've all got in common, you as employers, I'm an employer, is we've all got two classes of employees. One is our superstars. Those are the people that you can give them an assignment, give them the resources they need, and then get out of their way and let them do their thing, and they're going to do it well. But we also have that other group. I don't like name calling. I'm not going to do it. I'll just say that that's the group that your best day at work is the day they call off sick. Now you're thinking of somebody, and we know that because I am too. Excuse me. I share this with you because I want you to realize that just because they are a superstar in day-to-day activities does not mean, excuse me, that they're going to be a superstar in a disaster or a crisis situation. When the whole world is outside the box, they may not be able to handle it. Been a lot of studies done on why people fail to respond during a crisis situation. And as I put some of these up, you're going to notice they're in different colors. And I'll show you why at the end. First one is some people have a subconscious need for normalcy. And again, these are the people who in their day-to-day operations or day-to-day activities in the workplace, they're superstars. This is normal for them. They do the same thing every day. They have good head on their shoulders. They've got the job down pat. They do a great job. But when everything starts to break loose, suddenly that normalcy is gone and they're having a difficult time coping with that. Some people develop a sense of denial. They don't want to believe that it's happening, so they'll just deny it's happening. They'll cower down in a corner. They'll have a breakdown. A lot of times they're unable to comprehend the scope of the event. Like I said at the beginning, we didn't sign up for this. This is what we came to work expecting. So you can see the individual traits here, and some of them have an optimistic bias. Don't do anything. Just stay here. Everything's going to be okay. In my career in healthcare and in my career in the fire service, I wish it was an environment where I could tell people it's going to be okay. But if you're not prepared, it's not going to be okay. And that optimistic bias is going to hurt people. Some organizations, though, have a bad safety culture, and I've worked with a lot of them. I go in, I do a lot of mock OSHA audits and things like that, and I look at their safety culture. And I find a lot of communities, and maybe I shouldn't just isolate senior care. I find a lot of organizations, because we work with hospitals, we work with schools, we work with manufacturings, we work with a lot of insurance companies. So I visit a lot of organizations outside of healthcare. Well, but healthcare is where I grew up and it's my passion. But you see a lot of organizations that talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. All right, they'll talk about safety, but when you start looking at their programs, safety is not anywhere close to where it should be. They do no planning or no preparedness. They don't want to accept that it can happen to them, so they're not going to do any planning. They're not going to do any preparedness work. They're not going to do any training. And this bothers me because I can't begin to tell you how many times I've been told that we don't want to do, and I'm going to bring this last one up, we don't want to do any type of training or any practice or any exercises or drills because we don't want to scare people. We don't want people to think it can happen. Guys, people watch the news. They know it can happen. And I can promise you, every family of your residents and every one of your residents who's cognitively capable expect you to be prepared. And they expect you to be prepared when the fire alarm sounds, like you are. They expect you to be prepared when an armed intruder is in the building. So, we can't turn our back on training our staff. We can't turn our back on doing these exercises and these drills because all that's going to do is increase the casualty count. We have to be prepared. The other side of it is, too, that the more we practice and more we exercise, the more we develop muscle memory. So if the real thing happens, we've practiced it so much, it's second nature. We don't even have to think about it. I want to talk for a little bit about how we put an active shooter program together for a senior care community. And this applies whether it's skilled nursing, housing, assisted living, memory care, all of the above. First step is, guys, it starts out, you've got to do a security vulnerability assessment. If you've got somebody qualified in-house to do it, that's great. If not, find somebody to do it for you that is qualified in healthcare. And I say it that way, and I'm not here to upsell. That's not my intent at all today, I promise you. But I can remember years ago getting a call from a client saying, OSHA just showed up on site. How soon can you be here? And it was fortunate, it was only a couple-hour drive. So I was able to get my car, get my stuff together, get my car and get up there to the north side of Chicago pretty quickly. But when I got there, that OSHA surveyor, and she was very honest and I respected her for it. First thing was she's dressed in a sweatshirt, blue jeans, and hiking boots. Not appropriate, in my opinion anyway, for a healthcare environment, for a professional environment. But she was very apologetic. She said, I don't know anything about, she said, nursing homes. I don't know anything about senior care. I don't know anything about nursing homes. I do primarily factories, but they called me and told me to come over here and do this one. She didn't know anything about the industry. It was probably the easiest OSHA survey I've ever been through. You've got to work with somebody who understands the industry, because if not, and God bless them, you're not going to find a bigger fan of police officers than me. But police officers are not the ones to do security vulnerability assessments. They don't understand the industry. When police officers come in, they're looking at it from the mindset of their response. And I've got 3 retired police officers that work for me, either full-time or part-time. I can promise you, when they walk in the door, they're not thinking about you. They're thinking about them. They're thinking about, what are we going to do when we get here? When we're talking about active shooters, when they get there, they're going to put an end to the nonsense. But we have to survive, and we are responsible for our survival from the time that first shot is fired, or the time that person comes in and we recognize that they're an armed intruder, until the time the police get there. Now, in some of your communities, that may only be a couple of minutes, but in rural, especially where you're relying on a county sheriff's department or something who typically are low staffed, you may be looking at a 10 to 15-minute police response time, and you're going to be responsible for your safety and your residents' safety until then. So doing everything we can do to minimize the threat is what a security vulnerability assessment is about. And we'll talk more about these. Then you're going to develop an active shooter emergency response plan. You've got to have that written plan, policy, procedure, whatever you want to call it, that is specific to you. I'm not a fan of going out and buying them off the shelf, because it needs to be specific to you, to your specific community. And if you're part of a bigger system where you might have multiple communities in the same town owned by the same parent company, you can't have, oh, here's our corporate plan. That's not going to work for you. It has to be specific to your building, because the way a plan is written for a 1-story building is going to be a lot different than how it's written for a multiple-story building. How it's going to be written for a community that might be all senior housing or might be all memory care is going to be different from one that's a CCRC, where you're going to have buildings or parts of buildings that are reaching a number of different types of residents. So, you know, again, it has to be specific to you. Then you're going to develop your active shooter training program. Then you're going to train your staff on your program. I want to put emphasis on that. And then you've got to think about recovery, and recovery is a forgotten element. Even think about your fire plan. You got a fire plan that talks about what are we going to do when the fire alarm sounds, how to use a fire extinguisher, how to use the pull stations, you know, how to make sure exits are clear and unobstructed, blah, blah, blah. You don't think about recovery. What are you going to do after those big red trucks go home and you've got a burned out building, or you've got a burned out tenant apartment, or whatever the case may be? You've got to have a recovery plan as well, because tomorrow's going to come either way. So you've got to be ready for that. So when we talk about a security vulnerability assessment, the assessment is designed, you want to answer several questions. First of all, from whom and from what should your facility be protecting itself? In other words, what are the threats? Now we're talking active shooter. So what are some of the threats of active shooter? Well, it could be a family member of a resident who has expired and they're blaming you for the fact that the resident expired. It could be domestic, like the one I talked about earlier, where you had the individual who served divorce papers and he comes into the workplace to carry out a hostile activity. It could be a disgruntled former employee. All those types of things need to be identified. So from whom and from what do you need to be protecting yourself? Then you look at, what are the chinks in the armor in our security management program that could allow this to happen? These are the vulnerabilities. And, you know, when we do an assessment, you know, depending on the size of the community, we're identifying, you know, our average report to a client is somewhere around 25 pages of identified vulnerabilities. So, you know, you have to see things you're going to see things that you look at every day and you miss them. And that's why you have to put yourself in the mindset of a bad guy if you're going to try to do this on your own. And again, what are the likely consequences or the outcomes if we do have an armed intruder or an active shooter? What are the risks? Now, I use the term risk in this case as an outcome, even though I've been a risk manager most of my adult life. You know, in this case, risk is outcome. If I smoke cigarettes, I risk lung cancer. If I don't wear my seatbelt and I get in a traffic accident, I risk serious injury. So we think about this as risks as outcomes. And then once we know the answers to those questions, we can start putting together a plan to minimize those vulnerabilities, to lessen the chances of something happening. I can't eliminate it. You can't eliminate it, because we are still an industry that has people coming in and out all the time. But there's a lot we can do to minimize it. Now, when we're looking at a vulnerability assessment, you always start from the outside of the property and you work your way in. It starts with that outer ring, your lighting, your fences, your gates, anti-ramming bollards, anything along those lines, security's presence, anything like that. Then we come to the what we call the buffer ring, which is the perimeter of the building. Locked doors, receptionists at entrance points, badge checking or ID checking for visitors coming into the building, some type of identification, access control into the building, all those types of things. And then we look at the inner ring, which is the core of the building. That's where our core assets are: personnel, storage of equipment, assets, drugs, medications, your computer, cybersecurity, those types of things, visitor escort, your policies and procedures that relate to visitors and to security. Hopefully you've all got a good security manual already in place. So step one is the vulnerability assessment. Step two then is to develop your active shooter plan. It's going to be developed based on the threats that you identified in your vulnerability assessment, which is why that vulnerability assessment is so critical. I can go to my doctor and say, Doc, I don't feel good. He doesn't just say, okay, Steve, here, take these pills. Let's hope for the best. He's going to do a workup on me, make a diagnosis, and then prescribe treatment based on the diagnosis. Well, that vulnerability assessment is the workup for the diagnosis, and now we can make the prescription. The shooter may be looking for one specific person. All right, I'm looking for an ex-wife. I'm looking for the person who fired me. I'm looking for that nurse that was taking care of mom and let her fall and break a hip, and then she died. So I'm not there to create a mass casualty. I'm just there looking for one person that I feel I've got a score to settle with. Or I may be looking for a high body count. I don't care who I shoot. I just want to shoot. I just want to shoot as many people as possible. And I'm going to keep shooting until one of three things happen. I run out of ammunition, I run out of victims, or the police stop me. Thing you got to realize, this is totally unique. There's not going to be a code team. Your fire alarm goes off, you got a code red team or something like that responding. You got a combative resident, you got some kind of trained response team, I hope, responding. Active shooter, there's not going to be a code team. All right, there's going to be probably you, maybe a coworker, and you're responsible for your survival and probably the survivability of your residents as well. And again, chaos is going to reign. Right? We practice this stuff. We want you to practice this stuff. We want you to get good at this, knowing this is probably never going to happen. Because when it does happen, chaos will reign. I promise you. And you met my friend Frank DeAngelis from Columbine High School. He'll tell you chaos will reign. You're going to be shaking so bad. Your heart rate is going to be racing. Your respiratory rate's going to be sky high. You may start having some gross motor skill deficits, some fine motor skill deficits. You're almost going into a hyperventilatory state. It's the scaredest you're ever going to be. Let me just say that. And like I said, it may only be you and a colleague to get together. So when we develop our plan, we develop it with a mindset of first getting out of there. If we can't get out, we want to hide. If we get confronted, we want to be able to try to fight our way out if we have to as a last resort. But the goal is always to survive. Like I said, I can't give you a prescription or a recipe to prevent it. If I could, I'd be sitting on a beach with an umbrella drink right now somewhere, certainly not in the Chicago area in the wintertime or in the early spring. But also see that bottom line, guys, that it won't happen here gives you no survival value. Denying that it can happen in your community has no survivor value, right? It's realistic. So what we need to do is we need to develop that plan with a survival mindset. And some of the things we want your plan to include is, where are my exits? Where are my hiding places? How do I barricade? What do I have to protect or defend myself and my residents in terms of weapons of opportunity? And we'll look at that in a little bit. But you also need to remember, in our healthcare environment, it's often much more challenging to find a door that you can close and lock in order to hide. We always joke, hospitals and nursing homes, only difference between them and the hotel is, at the hotel, you get to lock your room door. In these places, you don't. So you've got to be thinking about that as well. And I tell all my clients, in your active shooter plan, or if I'm developing a plan for them, I'm going to identify by wing or by floor, depending on the type layout of the building. This is why I say it has to be specific to you. I'm going to identify in advance in my plan all the rooms that are suitable that I could move residents into, that I can move staff into, visitors, whatever. and lock the doors. That may be medication rooms, maybe washrooms, maybe janitor's closets, maybe utility closets. Where can I hide people? Then when we start to develop our plan, we got two choices. You can use a program called Run, Hide, Fight, which is developed by the Department of Homeland Security. Or you can use, and again, guys, I'm not trying to sell. This is our program, the 4 outs, but it's been adopted as program of choice by Argentum for its 30,000 members. Many of the leading age chapters recommend it for their clients because it's specific to our environment. It's Run, Hide, Fight on steroids. You'll see that in a minute. All right. It's used in settings where, Run, Hide, Fight is great. It's a fantastic program. We use it with all of our industry clients. We use it with all of our retail clients. But the commonality there is Run, Hide, Fight is meant for an environment where everybody is an adult and everybody is capable of taking care of themselves. We know that in healthcare, that's not the case. We don't have just ourselves to worry about. We have residents who are probably going to be dependent upon us for their own survival. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. But I'm going to run a couple of short videos on Run, Hide, Fight and the 4 outs, just so you can appreciate the difference between the two of them. This first one's got a disclaimer warning, but I promise you there's no blood or anything like that in it. It's shot in an environment where it's all adults.
I can start drinks.
Oh, sorry, I gotta take this.
We'll leave a minute.
Back up! You can't be here and get out of my face. What, you think I'm afraid of you?
Run. Your chances of survival. Don't go up here. Police, where is he? By the bar, blue jeans, black shirt. Empty hands up, follow their instructions. I'm in a direct line of fire if I head for either exit, but I have other options to help me survive. Guys, come on, in here. Go. Lock and barricade the door.
My exits are blocked by the shooter. I gotta stay hidden. I'm no victim. I'm ready for this.
He's applying direct pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding until we can find a tourniquet. In the meantime, turn off your phones and make a plan to defend yourself.
Zombies. The bartender will go for the head. We got it right here. Over here.
You can survive a mass shooting if you're prepared. Remember, run, hide, or fight. Run.
All right, it's just going to be repeating it. It's a great program. I advocate it. Like I said, we teach it to a lot of our clients. But you notice that was set in a nightclub environment. Everybody in there is over 21. Everybody in there was able to take care of themselves. It just doesn't work that way in the senior care communities, though. We have to think about our residents as well. This is a short video on the 4 outs. This is one we shot right here. We actually did this for Willis Tower Watson Insurance, and we use it all over now.
Active shooter event is something that none of us ever want to imagine happening in a senior living community. But the reality is that all places where people congregate, including senior living communities, are vulnerable, and that vulnerability results in an increased need for preparedness. Hi, I'm Steve Wilder, president of Sorensen, Wilder and Associates in Bradley, Illinois. Over the past several years, I've worked with hundreds of senior living and long-term care communities around the country in planning for, responding to, and recovering from active shooter events. The leaders of your organization are taking steps to minimize the chances of an active shooter event occurring in your community. But no matter how hard they are working, there are no guarantees that it will not happen. The fact remains, active shooters have already targeted senior living communities in various parts of the nation. No community, no town, no culture, and no faith is exempt from the risk. And while the chances of it happening in your community are low, it is still of critical importance that you are prepared. The senior living environment presents unique challenges in an armed intruder situation. In most other types of buildings and businesses, all you have to worry about is yourself. In a senior living community, the responsibilities are much greater. Not only do you have to think about yourself, you also have to think about protecting the residents, many of whom are unable to take care of themselves. This presents unique problems that need to be considered when developing your plans to respond to this type of event, and makes your understanding of what to do critical. The essential goal of your training and preparedness is to minimize the loss of life. Senior living communities strive to be welcoming to family members and resident visitors. Even with controlled access, doors are often unlocked during normal business hours, and resident guests and vendors may have access to the community throughout the day and evening. The openness and accessibility of the community environment can make it easier for a dangerous person, an armed intruder, or an active shooter to enter and threaten the safety of the people inside. A shooter in a senior living community is unthinkable. If we hear the sound of gunshots, we think it must be something else. But the first rule of survival is quite simple. If it sounds like gunfire, treat it as gunfire until you know otherwise. We have to be prepared for the worst. We want the sound to be anything but gunfire, but by being prepared for the worst, we improve the chances for survival for ourselves and our residents. With an active shooter in a senior living community, there are 4 immediate choices, which we refer to as the 4 outs: get out, hide out, keep out, and take out. Survival is typically the result of 2 critical components: having a plan and being prepared. Your plan does not have to be complex. In reality, a simple plan will be easier to remember and to carry out. Get out. The first step for survival is to identify where the shooter is located in the building in relationship to where you are. This becomes a critical factor when faced with that difficult decision between your personal safety and the safety of your residents and others. The general rule is the farther away the shooter is, the more time you'll have to focus on yourself, your residents, and others. If the shooter is in a different part of the building, your greatest chance for survival may be to get out. If possible, move yourself, your residents, and others out of the building. Leave your belongings behind, but bring a phone with you if it is in your possession. Do not lose valuable time going back for a phone. Focus on getting as many people out as possible. If time allows, announce there is an active shooter in the building. From the moment the first shot is fired, the shooter knows that 911 has been called and that the authorities will arrive quickly. The shooter's goal is to create as many casualties as possible in a short period of time. Make no mistake about it, this will probably be the most scared you will ever be in your life. When moving residents, yourself and others, be as quiet as possible. You do not want to draw attention to yourself, nor do you want the shooter to realize what you are doing. Pre-plan in advance where your emergency exits are and where you are going to relocate to. When you get to a safe location, call 911. Never assume someone else is called. There is no such thing as too many calls to 911. If getting out is not an option, your second choice is to hide out. Hiding out is meant to accomplish one thing: make it difficult for the shooter to locate you. Your objective is to try to hide your residence, yourself, and others in a place where the shooter cannot easily find you. Be familiar with the building's layout and pre-plan the rooms that you could use as a hideout. The shooter will likely be moving quickly, seeking out as many targets of opportunity as possible, knowing the police are on the way. If you're hiding out in an office or a similar type room, turn off lights, lock doors, place heavy furniture or equipment in front of the door if possible, and move away from the door. Try to make the room look dark and unoccupied. It is highly unlikely that the shooter will take time to try to kick down or shoot through a door, knowing the police are already on their way and time is limited. Silence your cell phone, turn the vibration mode off as well. Turn down the volume on two-way radio devices. Remain in this room until the threat has ended, and recognize leaders of your organization or the police advise you that it is safe to come out. Know in advance what rooms can be locked and incorporate these rooms into your planning and training. And remember, in a senior living community, moving multiple residents into one room that can be secured is a very viable option. An even more challenging situation you may be faced with is how to protect your resident and yourself in a resident room where the doors to the room cannot be locked. This is common in a skilled nursing environment or in a memory care unit. In such cases, we add our third element: keep out. Here, in the absence of locks on the doors, you will have to rely almost entirely on the contents of the room to secure entry and protect the residents and yourself. You do have a distinct advantage. Resident beds, some of which can weigh several hundred pounds, make an excellent barrier when placed against the door. Lock the wheels and use additional furniture in the room, such as dressers and chairs, to add weight and resistance. We want to use all of the resources available to us to keep the shooter from gaining access to the room. We typically think of heavy articles of furniture, but don't hesitate to use smaller items that can add weight and resistance as well. Along the same lines, when the shooter is in a different part of the building, but getting out is not an option because of medical conditions, mental status, or acuity concerns, you may also consider building a wall of obstruction in front of the emergency fire doors leading into your unit. Fire doors are typically held open by magnetic devices and cannot be locked. Typically, one door opens in one direction and the other swings in the opposite direction. By building this wall of obstructions, our intent is not to prevent the door from being open, but to create so many obstacles for the shooter to get past that he will instead move on, seeking out more accessible targets of opportunity. In rare cases, and only as a last resort, when you are unable to move the residents or yourself and are unable to secure the room, you may consider a concept called hiding in plain sight. Hiding in plain sight is accomplished by staying outside of the shooter's vector of sight, even though you may be in the same room. Hidden corners, washrooms, closets, and other recesses in a room might provide a suitable location to hide in plain sight. The shooter, who is moving quickly knowing the police are getting near, looks inside the room for targets of opportunity. Trapped in the room and unable to escape, the associate hides in a corner, trying to stay outside of the shooter's line of vision. As a last resort, and only as a last resort, you may have no choice but to try to take out the shooter. In other words, fight back. When this becomes the case, remember there is no such thing as a fair fight. This is the fight of your life because this is the fight for your life. The intent is to stop the shooter from being able to hurt you or anyone else. Identify weapons of opportunity that you have available to you. Remember, many of the things we use in our day-to-day activities can become weapons of opportunity when needed. Fire extinguishers become impact weapons. Pens, scissors, and letter openers become edged weapons. Stethoscopes, telephone cords, trouser belts all become choking weapons. We don't typically think about them like this because that is not their intended use, but this is a life or death situation that requires quick decisions and actions if you are going to survive. When fighting back, commit to actions of disabling the shooter. There is strength in numbers. The more people you have to help you, the better your chances of survival. Strike the shooter hard, using surprise, aggression, and speed, and don't stop until he has been disabled. It is also important to understand that the first arriving police officers are not there to tend to the injured. Their job is to stop the shooter. Never approach the officers, run towards them, or make aggressive moves against them. Once police arrive, exit the building with empty hands, with your hands high and your fingers spread. Even if you know the officers, remain focused on your safety and the safety of your residents, and allow the police and the first responders to do their job. An active shooter in a senior living community is unthinkable, but it has happened, and it's taught us an important lesson. The best way to survive and preserve life is to be prepared. Have a plan and rehearse and practice the plan. Know your surroundings and the exits. Keep your community secure, stay alert, and remember the 4 outs that can help to keep you and your residents protected. Get out, hide out, keep out, and take out.
Okay, so you can see the difference in the two programs. Hopefully you can appreciate why we use the 4 outs, more specifically for, we use them in a couple of environments. We use them in hospitals, we use them in senior care, and we use them in elementary education where the little kids can't take care of themselves. They got to rely on the teacher. So you get your plan developed, hopefully using the 4 outs, and then you develop a training program consistent with that. Now, again, and I'm very sensitive to our time here, friends. Again, we want to realize that survival is not a random outcome. Survival is the result of training. Your training program should include what are the different types of active shooter events, and there are different types we're not talking about today. Characteristics of the behaviors, and somebody put a question in the chat about mentioning genders, and that's a great point. I appreciate that. For years, we always thought that the probability was it was going to be a male, but that is changing. We've seen a number of shooting events in the last couple of years that have been perpetrated by female offenders. So we can't say it's going to be gender specific, but yeah, statistically, it's typically going to be a male. All right, so we want to train them on characteristics of the behaviors that we talked about. We want to talk about stress management, ways that we can manage the stress that goes with fear. What are your facility response protocols? How do you decide? And again, these are all things that we don't have time to go into today, but a good program will teach. And that is how do I make the decision between personal safety and resident safety? And what are the recovery considerations that have to be taken in? Now, that's the training that we provide for the leadership personnel. When we're training floor staff, they don't need all that. Those folks are out there on the floor. They need to know what to do when they hear gunshots. So we train them in the types of active shooter events and your response protocols. And that's all they need to worry about. Leadership, yeah, you've got a lot more weight on your shoulders. And again, I got to go back to what I said earlier. People don't want to train because they don't want to scare us. Well, you know, I fly all over the country all the time. Every time I get on a flight, they go through that emergency thing. They're not trying to scare us. They're not trying to make us think the plane's going to crash or that we're afraid to fly, but they are doing it to prepare us in case there is an emergency. So in advance, we know what to do. And all we're talking about here is the same thing. We're preparing for this type of an event, same as we are any other type of event. So your training program, like I said, train for the 4 outs, right? And review them here, get out, hide out, keep out, and take out. And then make it multi-level. And guys, I've got to emphasize this. I can't tell you how many communities I've gone and done training for over the last 5-10 years or so. And I got great turnout, but nobody from the C-suites is there. And that's going to get you in trouble for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you have an event, OSHA is going to be there and they're going to ask to see your training records. And when they see that nobody from senior administration was attending the training, you're going to get dinged hard financially. And number two, more from a practical point of view, people are looking to senior leadership for leadership. So if you don't go through the training, now they've gone through the training, they know what your plan says to do, they've practiced and trained on what to do. Now you're coming in and you may be telling them to do something completely the opposite. And in a crisis situation, now they don't know what to do. Do they do what the training said? Do they do what you're telling them to? So senior management has to participate in all this training, just like everybody else. Now we have to understand that when we talk about response, training is critical. And I could go on all day talking about training, but I really want you to realize that whether you're trained or untrained, your initial response is going to be the same, and that is startle and fear. And anybody that says they're not scared when this happens because they're trained is nonsense, right? I've seen just about every fire known to man, type of fire known to man except nuclear, And I've run into buildings that are burning to the point that the rats and the cockroaches are running out. I'm trained, probably by some of the best trainers over the years. But every time I'm running into a burning building, I'm still scared. And if you're not scared, you're going to become a casualty because you start to think that you're untouchable, and you're not. So startle and fear are normal responses. But the difference becomes when a person is trained and prepared, they're going to have anxiety. They're going to recall what they learned. You know, that training that they had is going to come back into the forefront of their memory, and they're going to act as they've been trained. And that's why I said earlier, the more you train, the more you build muscle memory. But when I look at the untrained person or the unprepared person who didn't go, they're not going to have any anxiety. They're going to have panic. They're going to be having a meltdown, right? They're going to be frozen with fear, disbelief, denial, and they're going to stay frozen in shock and denial. They will become a liability to you. Now, one of the things, as it said in the video, number one rule, if you hear what sounds like gunshots, it is gunshots until it's proven otherwise. And I've worked with so many companies now that have had shooting events, and I've heard all the responses. We thought it was a car backfiring, or we thought somebody had set off firecrackers, or we thought somebody slammed a phone book on this. Guys, no. You don't have cars backfiring in your hallways. You don't have people shooting fireworks at work. And we don't even have phone books anymore. We Google. So, you know, if it sounds like a gunshot, it is a gunshot until it's proven otherwise. Now, because of time, you know, we've already talked about the 4 outs. We've talked about it in the video. You know, get out, move quickly, leave your belongings behind. When we talk about the safety action plan, you know, again, call 911. There's no such thing as too many calls 911. The other thing I'd like for you to check, though, many communities now have 911 texting capabilities. Find out if your community has that. Because if you have 911 texting capabilities, you're hiding out. You can still send a text message to 911 saying that we have an active shooter in the building, we have people hiding in the building, and you're going to get the same police response. And I've got to mention this, you know, give the name of the shooter if you know it. Give them the description of the shooter. Now, you don't have to go into great detail. White male, 6 foot tall, bald head, wearing a black shirt. That's a good start. All right, that narrows it down quite a bit. If we know the location of the shooter, tell him. Last time we saw him, he was in the main lobby, but he was moving towards the C wing. Or if you know the type of weapon. And again, all you need to tell him is he's got a handgun, which means you hold it in your hand, or he's got a long gun, which means it's got a long barrel and typically butts up against the shoulder. Shotgun rifle, something like that. They don't need to know it's a Smith & Wesson, it's a Glock, it's a Winchester, it's a 38, it's a 12. None of that matters. They just need to know if it's a handgun or a long gun. Hideout, as we said, turn off the lights, close the blinds, barricade the doors if you can. You know, beds, furniture, anything you can use. If the door has windows, try to put some kind of a window covering over it. And everyone ends the same, call 911. Again, I know I'm going fast. There's also a number of different items on the market that you can buy if you want to spend the money. Now, some of these you have to be sensitive to, because if your health department sees them, they're going to ding you. I've also trained a lot of health department surveyors in various states over the years, and the attitude of the surveyors has been pretty common. If we see them, we're obligated to ding you. If we don't see them, we don't know about it. In other words, don't leave them sitting out. But there's a lot of different articles, things you can buy. You know, door jammers, they call them. There's all kind of different things. You can go out on the market and find plenty of things that you can use in rooms that you can't secure. I don't always advocate for them, but I do have a few when I'm doing live training that I usually bring with me and show them off a little bit. And again, if it's a takeout, you're going to fight back. There's no such thing as a fair fight. All right, you got to believe that. This is a fight for survival. This person didn't come in to scare you. You know what they came in for. I don't have to say it. Now, when the police arrive, first of all, as we've said a couple times in the video and in the program, hands are above your head, hands are empty, fingers are spread. Show them that you don't have anything in your hands. They don't know who the shooter is. So everybody's coming out of that building potentially is the shooter. So, you know, you come running out and you've got a stapler or something like that in your hand to a police officer, and yeah, their stress levels up too. They know what they're going into. You know, having that stapler in your hand could look like a small caliber handgun. So hands are empty, over your head, fingers spread wide. Don't shout at the officers. Don't try to run to them. Jimmy Mininger is a retired police officer out of Philadelphia who worked with us for a number of years. If a panic-stricken person runs at an officer and attempts to grab hold, he or she is likely to get knocked on his or her butt or worse. And Jim and I were doing a program for Pennsylvania leading age, I think, a number of years ago, and he made that statement, and it just struck me. And I went back afterwards and talked with him about it, and we put it into the program. When the police get there, as the video said, they're not there to try to help cut the casualty count or to save the injured. They've got to stop the gunman or the casualty count keeps going up. If police walk in and they hear the gunshots, they're going to go to where the sound of the gunshots is coming from. If there's no shots being fired, then they're going to go into a search mode and start sweeping the building. And friends, I'll tell you, I don't know how long it's going to take them to get there, but you're going to get a lot of them. I promise you that. We had an incident here at our Target store in my town a couple of years ago where some guy came in, and our Target's the same as every other Target in America. I think you walk in the front door, turn to the left, you got the restrooms and you got Starbucks. Came in, he walked in, went to the men's room, used the restroom, came out, stood out by the Starbucks, and for some reason at the top of his lungs, he screamed, "America's going to hell and we're all going to die." Somebody in the back of the store heard that and thought, "Oh, we're all going to die. It's an active shooter." Called 911, said there's an active shooter in the Target store. And I kid you not, friends, they counted a total of 13 law enforcement agencies. We had local police, neighboring communities, sheriff's department, state police. We had U.S. Marshals responding. We had FBI responding. We didn't realize all these agencies were even in town at the time this happened. So you're going to get an onslaught of law enforcement. I just can't tell you how soon they're going to get there. And that's why your ability to stay prepared and to have a plan to protect yourself and your residents is so critical. And again, like I said, we got a plan for recovery. Dilbert's plan of standing out on the porch yelling, "Help, help," that's just not going to work, right? We have to have a good recovery plan. First of all, realize it's a crime scene, and it's going to remain a crime scene after the incident is over, because there's going to be a lot of investigation coming on. I think Columbine, Frank told me, it was a crime scene for 7 months after the shooting. And we're coming up on the anniversary date. Today's April 17th. The anniversary date of that shooting is April 20th. And that's a very unique date because the two shooters, and I will not dignify them by using their names, but the two shooters at Columbine did the shootings on April 20th, 1999. April 20th is Adolf Hitler's birthday. And we're coming up on that. And with all the stuff going on right now in Jerusalem, and Israel and the Gaza Strip and everything, Palestine, yeah, this security consultant's a little bit nervous right now because I'm thinking about a lot of my clients who are Jewish, Jewish communities and things like that, Jewish hospitals. And I'm worried about them because who knows what's going to happen on Hitler's birthday. Your recovery plan should look something like this. All right. If you have an incident, obviously you need some type of recovery plan, an emergency operation plan, but recovery takes place when the event is over. The goal of recovery is to return to normal as quickly as possible. I can't define what normal is going to look like, right? Normal before the shooting is not going to be normal after the shooting. I can say Columbine High School and everybody thinks one thing. Oh yeah, that school that had the shooting. Nobody thinks about academic excellence. Nobody thinks about, they were state football champions 6 years in a row. All we think about is a shooting. Normal prior to April 20th, 1999 and normal today are two very different things. It may take months, days, months, weeks, whatever, for recovery to complete. You also need to think about what resources are you going to need. Just off the top of my head, you're going to need crisis counseling. You're going to need cleanup and restoration if you have casualties. You don't want your housekeeping people doing that. You're going to need grief counselors. You're going to need legal. You're going to need media assistance. You're probably going to need some security on the grounds because you're going to have all kind of gapers trying to drive by, just folks in the community trying to see where it happened, see what happened, see what they can see. So, there's a lot of resources you're probably going to need that if you don't already have a relationship with them, I would encourage you to develop one now, because the last thing you want at 2 o'clock in the morning is to be calling ABC cleanup saying, "We need help. We just had a shooter," and you're waking them up and they're saying, "I'm sorry, this is who from where?" You need that relationship with them in advance. When you call them at 2 in the morning, they say something like, "I'm so sorry this has happened. I'll have a team there in an hour." So, build those relationships. Think about the resources you might need. and build those relationships. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about real quickly is how to make that decision between resident safety and personal safety, because that's a tough decision I hope nobody ever has to make. You know, questions are going through your mind. How do I protect myself? How do I protect my residents? When do I act? When do I react? We developed a program a number of years ago that we called STAFF, Safety Transition Adjustment Formula, right? It's a formula for making that decision between resident safety and personal safety. And guys, it's a balancing act. The scale is, you know, even between the residents and employee safety, but you're going to have to make that decision. And I sympathize because nobody should have to. All right. First of all, question number one, you hear gunshots. We already established you're going to say, okay, it's a gunshot. It's not a phone book. It's not a firecracker or anything like that. Where are you in relationship to the bad guy? Does it sound like that gunshot was close to you? Or does it sound like it was somewhere else in the building? That's got to be the first question asked, because that's going to be the basis of everything to come, right? If it, and I'm looking over here on the left side of the screen, if the bad guy's location is distant from you, you put resident safety first, and you can start moving residents out, exit the building, get the residents out of the building. And people ask me, isn't the bad guy going to chase us out? No, I cannot find any case in any industry where the bad guy has chased people out of the building, because the bad guy knows that the police are coming and they're coming in from the outside. So he's not going to go outside where the police are coming in. He's got a much greater chance of safety and survival inside the building if he stays inside and can use the floor plan of the building, can use hiding places and things like that to his or her advantage. So if the person is distant, you put resident safety first. But if that shooter is in close proximity to you, you have to put personal safety first. And guys, I'm sorry if that sounds selfish. I don't want to sound that way. But, you know, if something happens to you, who's going to take care of them? You're not going to be able to call an off-duty shift in. Police aren't going to let anybody else come in, for one thing, but there's still residents that have to be cared for. And it's going to take a while to be able to get to a point where you can ship them off to another facility if you have to. So remember that decision making. It's a simple formula. If the shooter is a distance away from you, another part of the building, another floor of the building, something like that, start moving residents out or moving them into hiding places. If the shooter is close to you, if they're immediate proximity, personal safety comes first. Critical component, guys, is the time of recognition. All right. Employee awareness, and that's why I say it's so critical. The minute you hear gunshots, you start to ask, where is that person in the building? All right. Announce it to the facility, PA system, intercom systems, whatever you've got, you got to send out. And you heard me earlier refer to your color codes as silly. That's because I don't advocate color codes. We got too many of them. Everybody's scared to death right now. And somebody's going to confuse a code black and a code gray and a code silver, or whatever color code you're using for an active shooter. Let's instead build our plan with an announcement that says, attention all staff, we have an unauthorized intruder in the building. All staff follow appropriate protocols. I didn't say we've got a shooter. I didn't say armed. We have an unauthorized intruder. And as part of our training, we can train our staff to know that an unauthorized intruder means we have an armed person. And that's the protocols they're going to follow. Again, study that staff protocol, transitioning between resident and personal safety. And realize that the minute the bad guy's in your area, you've got to survive. Right? I'm going to skip that because I know we're over time, but I'm hustling here. We're almost done. Okay, if we're going to hide out and keep out, as the video said, know your facility. Again, identify by floor, by wing, whatever, where your locations are at. Where can we hide and secure residents? Secure them in their room. We can use janitor's closet, medication rooms, all those kind of places. Or we can hide them in plain sight. You saw in the video hiding in plain sight. It's a last resort, but it's a very effective one. Now, some of the resources that are available out there, and guys, I'll stay with you as long as I need to if you have questions. But I know we had an hour time limit. But some of the resources are out there. Our website and that video that we showed, that's on the homepage of our website. You can scroll down to the bottom. The 4 Outs video is right there. You can play it. I've got a lot of places that aren't even clients of ours that I know of that are using it in their new employee orientation, and that's fine. It's out there for you. Our goal isn't to get rich or anything like that. I want everybody to go home safe. U.S. Department of Homeland Security has some good stuff out there. The International Association for Healthcare and Security and Safety has some, and California Association of Health Facilities has some really good disaster prep and active shooter stuff specific to the state of California, but it's still got a lot of good material. So guys, I know we're about out of time. Like I said, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions if you have any. But also, I know people are on a time limit. My contact information is there. Please don't hesitate to drop me an email. Please don't hesitate to give me a call if you've got questions or thoughts. I welcome them. Again, you'll never get a 15-minute phone call bill or anything like that. We want to make sure that people are going home safe at the end of the night. So, Mary, I'll turn it back over to you. And if there's questions, I'll be happy to entertain them.
Sorry about that, boy, I'm having a hard time getting my video to go back again. Thank you, Steve, really do appreciate it. You will be, if you are from a different state, we will be hearing from Sarah when she is back with the recordings and so on, that she will be passing along. So we thank you very much again and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, folks. Everybody stay safe.